You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am excited. I'm talking to Mark Vernon, author of a new book about William Blake, and I am always excited to learn from people who know a lot more than I do on a subject. So thank you so much for coming to join me, Mark Vernon.
Thank you for having me on. And I love talking about William Blake, and particularly maybe introducing people to someone who I think of as a friend of mine. So thanks for the chance to talk about it.
Now, for listeners interested, the book is coming, is it September 1st, correct?
Yeah, so I'm in the UK actually, and it is out in the UK. Came out in June in the UK, but September in the US. Yeah.
Okay. So depending on where you live and where you're listening, it may be on store shelves right now, or it may be available in the very near future. But, check the links in the show notes. I'll have all of that if you want to learn more, because today we're going to cover some broad stuff, but obviously the book goes into much greater depth than I ever could hope to on this show. Now, the first question I always love to ask authors, what made Blake a compelling subject to you? Because if I'm being honest, like early in my education, I had always heard the name Blake in connection to like poetry and writing. It wasn't until, I was a young adult studying art more seriously that I even became aware of his work in the visual arts and that realm. Can you explain a little bit about just what made him a subject that you wanted to dive into? What makes him such a compelling figure?
I mean, like you're saying, I read Blake probably at school, hardly even knowing, because he gets anthologized, poems like Tiger, Tiger Burning Bright. You read these as kids if you do any English literature. So he's always been around in my mind. And then he also writes, very brilliant and wonderful phrases that you wonder quite what he means, but you know that he means something really rather marvelous. And so you want to know more and more about that. And these are phrases like to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. And I remember being very intrigued by that. I work as a psychotherapist, actually, as well as writing. And so I'm very interested and drawn to inner life, but particularly also feel that the spiritual matters, however that might be conceived, whether you regard yourself as part of a particular tradition or more generally as well. And so I felt that Blake has something really important to tell us about all that. What does he mean when he says you can see a world in a grain of sand? And then I live in South London, and for quite a chunk of their life, William and his wife Catherine, they lived in South London. So he's kind of walking the streets that I walk. One of the stories about Blake that you'll know the minute you start to read about Blake is that he saw angels in a tree on a long field called Peckham Rye. And that's just down the road from me. It's now sort of a suburban plot. But in the time, it was on the edge of the fields at the outskirts of London. So it's sort of Blake is around, both in terms of my own education, but then also in the place I'm living. And I sense that he's got something for us now. And so, have been trying to tease that out. And the book, trying to give voice to that, is the where I've got to on that.
Yeah. And, you've already sort of alluded to the fact that he was grappling with a lot of spiritual stuff in his work. I mean, whether it was in his writing or his paintings and drawings and etchings, he was, I think we should probably start with just historical context. He was living and working late 18th century, right? And when I look at his work, in some ways, it feels very traditional to me in terms of like these spiritual themes and like, the historical allegorical stuff and that tradition of art. And yet there's something I can't quite put my finger on that's a little bit different than, the Renaissance and the historical stuff that we've seen from so many academic painters from roughly the same time period. And I realize I just said Renaissance and roughly the same time period don't write me. I do know those are, different time periods. The Renaissance obviously came much before Blake, but, I see it as a part of a tradition and an evolution, but also somehow a little bit different. Can you talk a little bit, just like to ground us in understanding Blake as a person and his development and how that came about, like how that influenced and shaped his writing and his art?
Yeah, I mean, just to say, actually, he loved Renaissance figures like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, figures that we assume that people always everywhere have loved. But actually, at his time, they were rather out of fashion. And so the link that you made there, clearly they're not, as you're saying, the same historical times, but maybe in some sort of artistic connection, Blake and the Renaissance do go together. But let me do the history. So he's born, in 1757, and then he dies in 1827. So this is the Georgian period in England. So it's a time of tremendous turbulence, actually. He's born during what's now called the 7 Years' War, which in his history of England, no less a figure than Winston Churchill said was the First World War. And the reason why he said that was because the British Empire and the English and then the French and the Napoleonic Wars all feature in Blake's life, as does the War of Independence in the US. George II is on the throne when Blake comes to be born, but George III soon follows. Mad King George, as sometimes we think of him now. The French Revolution comes, and then the Napoleonic War. So this is a time of tremendous turbulence. It's also a time of tremendous cultural change. The beginning of Blake's life, slavery is still firmly in place, for example. It gets banned during Blake's life. And so all the kind of turbulence and the sense of liberty that comes with that. It's a time when he's born, men are wearing knitted tights still, with great wigs on their heads and powder and so on. But trousers come into fashion during Blake's lifetime. And so this is one of the reasons why he's fascinating, actually, that so many of the things, whether it be sartorially or imaginatively, the sense of what's just and unjust, all these things are born really in Blake's time. And part of the appeal of Blake, I think, is that he writes to these and so still speaks to us now, but also, draws and so on as well. And just one more link with the Renaissance that he made explicit was he felt that much as figures like Michelangelo, Leonardo have played such an important role in the Renaissance period in terms of shaping and informing, deepening the kind of public consciousness. So he wanted his work to do the same, actually. And so part of the reason why he produced work in the way he did was precisely to make it accessible, so that it could channel something to people. He didn't achieve that in his lifetime. He died, relatively unknown, although known enough to survive, and hence, people now loving and knowing him very well indeed.
And I'm just trying to think, like, where was he in terms of like the progression of thought? I mean, he would have come after the Protestant Reformation. I'm thinking this is kind of Enlightenment era, like Locke and stuff like that. Can you just tell me what's sort of in the zeitgeist at the time? Because his stuff has a very religious and philosophical bent to it.
Yeah, so he's born a generation or two after towering figures in the 18th century, Isaac Newton, John Locke. And what Isaac Newton had done in terms of our understanding of the physical world, being able to analyze it, order it, describe these extraordinary links, really, between the falling of an apple, say, and the turning of the moon around the earth in the law of gravitation. This impulse to find order, to find symmetry, to arrange, to make things regular. And I'm using these words deliberately, regular, arrange, and order, because they're very Georgian words. That gets spread into the human psyche. John Locke writes about the mind as a kind of ordering capacity that we have, and then into forms of government as well. Figures like Tom Paine, hugely influential characters. His pamphlets sell by the tens of thousands, even in the first weeks. It's all about how a kind of rationalization of things can be brought about. And Blake he's not against reason, but what he worries is that the imagination that can connect us with that which is beyond what our reason alone can grasp. That's one of the things that he immediately hooks onto. And so in his own time, it's figures like Jeremy Bentham that are alive. Jeremy Bentham, who says that we can work out an ethic based on what he called the philosophic calculus, as if we can kind of work out what would bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number. Figures like David Hume, they're now known as an atheist or at least agnostic philosopher. Mary Wollstonecraft, the founder of feminism, she is not only alive in Blake's time, but Blake actually illustrates some of her books. Remember that he's a kind of jobbing engraver, and so part of how he earned a living was doing the designs and illustrations for other people's books, as well as producing his own work. So he's alive in this extraordinarily rich moment, reading people that we still read now as well.
Yeah, and you've already started to, I guess, anticipate my next question, which was going to be about what is William Blake making of all of these different movements? And, you've talked a little bit about how he wasn't against reason, but he didn't want to lose that imagination and the creativity and the spiritual dimension and stuff. Can you just help us, just walk me through, what was his, I guess, religious philosophical idea, what was his guiding principle or principles and ideas behind his work and what he was trying to express?
I mean, this is disputed now amongst readers of Blake. And then one of the things which I'm trying to do in my book is say, it's actually quite clear where Blake's coming from, but we've sort of forgotten that tradition even existed. And so people get confused about that. But broadly speaking, Blake is in, as you're saying, the post-Reformation mystical Christian tradition. So he lives in a time where deism is the dominant form of religiosity, certainly in a country like England. And of course, many of the founding fathers were deists. And this is an understanding of Christianity that sees God setting in motion an orderly cosmos and then giving us the moral guidance so we can know how to live in that orderly cosmos. And this is a very kind of widespread view. Blake worries about this because he realizes that it makes God this transcendent being that we may never know directly. We can only find by, say, following the moral codes that were felt to exist in the Bible. And he worries that this deism will become what it did, in fact, in the Victorian period, a sort of atheism. Because if God sort of floats off and you're left with the moral code, then someone's going to ask one day, well, do we even really need this God? Do we need the vitality that lay behind these moral codes? And what Blake worried about was that this uncouples us from other people, from the natural world, as well as from the divine, and even from ourselves. It builds in a kind of alienation. And so a lot of his work is, again, using phrases like to see a world in a grain of sand. How can we revive a felt participation, a love of the world in which we live, rather than the dominance of a sort of rationalizing approach to life? So he belongs, I think, in this mystical Christian tradition. He's not alone in that. There are other figures sort of bubbling up in his times. Perhaps the best known now is Charles Wesley. And Methodism, as it became, Charles Wesley was always part of the Church of England in his life. But Methodism originally was an attempt to renew a kind of felt sense of connection with the divine. But he pursues that in his own way, I think. And so for me, one way of putting it actually is that the Reformation, in a way, is a kind of collective trauma. It's such a massive shift that occurs in the 16th century. It's really almost hard to understate how dramatic a shift that was, moving people from, the last sense of things that belong to the medieval world into the modern world. But I think he feels that too much has been lost, and he wants to reconnect, particularly with that. If you're in the Christian world at all, you might think of it as a kind of sacramental cosmos, that everything speaks of more than itself and ultimately can communicate the divine to us.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about it's basically the foundation that you built your life on. Your faith, whatever it might be, is going to be the foundation that it informs so much of your day-to-day living and what you prioritize, that like to change from, the Catholic Church being the cornerstone to the Protestant faith and to say that like, oh yeah, never mind, we don't believe in this, and this, like that, I'm sure is a huge shift. And then as Enlightenment thinking is happening, and that's changing so much about the way we make sense of the world and what we think causes what in our world. I can imagine that's a rough transition for a lot of people. But now, after a short break, I want to get into just how Blake was capturing such big, heady philosophical ideas in his artwork. And now I'm back. My guest this week is Mark Vernon, the author of the new-ish book, Awake. I say new-ish because if you're in the UK, it's already out on store shelves. But if you're in America, it will be hitting the bookshelves starting September 1st. Either way, I would encourage you, check the links in the show notes, pick up a copy. We're talking about William Blake here and his work. And for this episode, I asked you, what's a particular favorite or standout to you? And you picked this one. Can you explain a little bit about why The Ancient of Days stood out to you as an important piece of Blake's?
I think The Ancient of Days, if people know of any of Blake's images, they'll know of this one. The figure of the seemingly divine figure with great beard and flowing locks, leaning out of breaking clouds with a sun disk behind him, but looking down through this giant pair of compasses, seemingly at the world beneath. And people get confused about this. They're sort of drawn to it. It's a very powerful image, and Blake worked on it for quite a long period of time, actually, producing many different versions of it. It first appears in his long poem called Europe, a Prophecy, which actually is about the French Revolution. And it comes after his long poem, America, a Prophecy, which had been about the American Revolution. And so this image is a kind of sense of the divine that people have, that he felt was operative both in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. So a sort of dominant sense of God that people had. And as well as just being a sort of brilliant, striking design, which Blake is so good at, with sort of stark use of color, very strong figurative imagery, but also a slight sense of strangeness, what's really going on. I think that what Blake's capturing here is a central sense for him of how we feel we live, you might say, in a kind of mechanical cosmos, how we live in a world where if only we can measure, get the right devices together to produce the right evidence, the right proof, like this demiurgic figure looking through these great compasses, we might be able to make the world a better place. This was a dominant idea in his time, a dominant idea in ours. And he's showing that it has a certain majesty. It's not just to be sniffed at. There's something of a good spirit behind this impulse. And clearly, the developments in science and technology and so on have brought many, many good things. But much as this figure is a sort of contracted divine figure, so too he worried that the world, for all its good, is going to bring darkness and ill in its wake. Much like this figure can't quite see the sun breaking through the cloud behind him, so focused has he become on things on Earth. So I love this figure because it's well known. People love it, but also wonder quite what it's about. And so it's a really, really good way into some of Blake's ideas to contemplate it.
Yeah, there's something interesting to me about this because I look at it and part of it feels like it could be on one of the pendantives in the Sistine Chapel or something like that. Like it has this feel of the like I said, I keep going back to to Renaissance stuff, but I feel like there is a connection, like the influence there. And maybe it's also partially because of just the oddness of the musculature of some of the like the Sibyls and stuff on the Sistine Chapel ceiling.
I mean,
but
you're absolutely right. I mean, Blake, he's quite explicit. He was directly influenced by Michelangelo, partly because he loved Michelangelo's imagery, but also because he wanted to be a kind of Michelangelo and get these great public commissions. When he was a youth, there's a story that he would go around the markets of London and buy bundles of replicas of Leonardo sculpture or Michelangelo prints or Raphael imagery. And he could get a lot of it because no one else was that much interested in it. But to him, it was the way to go. And, if you have that impulse, you get drawn to an old figure, then you go with that impulse because it very much informs his work as you're picking up.
But then I think what's interesting to me then is it also doesn't quite feel like a lot of the Christian iconography that I've seen, because, and this is, my own personal background. I grew up going to Catholic schools, K through 12. So I've seen a lot of religious imagery, and this has some of the feel and the hallmarks of it, but it's not a story that I know. It doesn't feel like, God coming down to the Garden of Eden or, the flood narrative or anything else like that. It feels in some ways like almost a synthesis of, the Christian tradition with almost like I don't know what's the proper term, but what they would have called a pagan ideology or something like, it feels like there's something different here in the nature of what the figure is doing and what they represent. And if I recall correctly, what was the name that he used for this sort of God, like Urizen. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
As like the personification of reason in here. It feels almost like Blake's creating his own new set of mythology, right?
No, I think he wants to educate us in part through mythology. And I think mythology differs from allegory in that mythology invites you to kind of enter into a complete world and to resonate with the figures and understand what draws them, know them from the inside out. And then when you return to the usual world in which we live, you're kind of more wise to what's going on. Imaginatively, you felt something. And so that becomes part of what you can detect in the world around you. And Urizen, it partly means like your reason, but perhaps it also means it resonates a bit with horizon. And so it asks you, what horizons are containing your world, or can you look over horizons as well? So he's very much in that tradition, rather than say the allegorical tradition, which would put together, one character stands for this, another character stands for that. And so this immersive experience is very much, what Blake's about. The modern comparison probably is the difference between, say, C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. And Blake would be much more like a Tolkien figure that creates whole worlds that can feel a bit, in inverted commas, pagan, because all sorts of figures are in there that don't have a direct correspondence with a traditional Christian worldview anyway. But the point is not to be subversive in the sense of, trying to say we need to become pagans again. It's much more about trying to ask how we can participate in the world in a different way.
So that's interesting. Now, one of the things that's always been a little bit murky to me, and I'm gonna expose a little bit of my own ignorance here, because Blake is not someone that I've gone and done a deep dive on. But one of the things I find interesting and a little bit confusing, I guess, or I'm not sure about, is, as you talk about this, is like he's creating this mythology and he's creating these stories to get at philosophical ideas. I appreciate that. But then there's also talk of like he had these visions from an early age. So I guess my curiosity, and I would love your clarification on this, was he, and as he's making these, is he literally seeing this mythology as truth, or is he using this more symbolically? You see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I think so. Let me try and respond and see whether it does get at what you're asking there, because it's really important, I think, actually. Yeah. So I think it's kind of neither one nor the other. It's neither literal nor symbolic. What he invites us to consider the possibility is that when we're looking at the world, say, when we're engaging with life, it's as much what we bring to that engagement that matters as what sort of comes at us. And our imagination particularly can open things up for us. Now, we need to discern it. He's absolutely clear that Urizen has an absolutely vital and fundamental place. At the end of one of his great long poems, he sees Urizen joining hands with Chaucer and Milton and Shakespeare. When the two are kind of working together, then you get this fullness of vision. But he I think he did see angels. He did see figures who had died. He wrote about having dinner one night with Ezekiel and Isaiah. He said, you guys are Old Testament prophets, but how did you know that what you were prophesying was true? And so it's this active, though, testing, you might say. It's not like a peak experience that kind of washes over you and leaves you a bit open-mouthed, not knowing quite what to do next. It's, in a way, it's much more humdrum, but it is being open to the way that our minds might tell us something through a felt connection, through, say, a mythology, through maybe the old stories associated with the place that you're in. Some have said this is a sacred grove. Why? What might that be about? And so he's trying to get us, not just, to put it another way, one of the big philosophical movements that he's definitely pushing back against is empiricism. Figures like John Locke were the founders of what's now actually even called British empiricism. And this is the idea that it's only evidence that we can trust. It's only sense perception in the sense of the way it gathers data from the world around us. That's the only thing we can trust. And Blake says, no, when you see something, you already bring a whole kind of imaginative, interpretative tool to that. And so it speaks to you of much more than just a green on the green leaf of a tree, or, of the red in the red of a sunset. It's moving you through its beauty. And he's saying we need to take that seriously. In a way, we've got no choice. This happens to us. But what he also seems to have had is a kind of capacity, whereas you and I might walk into a room and just have a kind of vague feeling that it's a comfy place, or there's something a bit strange about this room. He seems to have sometimes seen in the form of maybe shimmering lights, sometimes even in the form of embodied figures. What would have been called the angels in, say, Catholic writing in the medieval period, which someone like Thomas Aquinas would say is the kind of intelligence, the wisdom, the presence of a place in these figures. Blake seems to have had that capacity. He says actually, everybody has some capacity like that, but it's inclined to get educated out of us. Because we're told it's too freaky or strange or something, or we should just keep it quietly to ourselves. So he's inviting us not to become naive, but to sort of ask, might this be opening a world up to us and a worldview, therefore, that otherwise we're at risk of losing contact with?
Well, I gotta say, that is the first time that I have heard Blake presented in a way that, like, it clicks for me. I get it. I see it, and I can appreciate it. I really appreciate your psychological and philosophical background there, and the underpinnings there, like, really helped me to understand this artist and see it in a different way that honestly I can get behind more than I ever have. And again, that's largely my own, just I haven't studied him that much. But that's what I love about doing this show. Now, after one last short break, I want to push that a little bit further and ask for some more ideas on how we can make sense of and connect to Blake. Now, my guest this week, Mark Vernon, you wrote a whole book about Blake. The book is called Awake. Check the links in the show notes if you want to get a copy and learn more. But what I find really interesting, you have a background in psychology, and you've studied a lot of philosophy. And the question that I have here is, in the 21st century, why study an 18th century artist? Like, why do you feel his work, his writings, his ideas can resonate and be relevant to audiences today?
It's a very good question. I think it's because Blake has what you might call a spiritual analysis, or certainly a kind of inner analysis of his time, but his time has deeply informed our time. And because he lived at the beginning of what has become the modern world, he can help us get back inside what we now often just take for granted. Let me pick one phrase, again, quite a well-known phrase of Blake's, the dark satanic mills. It comes in these very famous lines now, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green. And he talks about the dark satanic mills. Now, people sometimes think that was a sort of poet looking across the landscape, seeing the Industrial Revolution in full swing. Blake is born when the Industrial Revolution is beginning, but really that industrialization of the landscape doesn't occur in his times. And yet he still comes up with a phrase that talks about, for him, satanic means the kind of contraction, the narrowing of things. And then he sees these mills. But what that is really about is how this takes a whole kind of imaginative preparation before the actual mills themselves start to appear. If you think about something like a car is a very brilliant bit of technology, very useful indeed, but it needs a whole kind of infrastructure in order to be of any use to us. It needs roads, it needs cities and the countrysides, the whole landscape sort of changed in order that then the car can be of great utility. And Blake said that's what happens with technology in general, that there's a kind of preparation of the inner landscape that's got to go on in order that then the technology can become, well, both, very useful to us, but also with the threat that somehow it's taking over our lives as well. There's a sort of tipping point. And so the phrase dark satanic mills is Blake saying our imagination's becoming such that we're feeling that the cosmos itself might be like a great mill. He writes about this in other ways, as if the sky itself is just great cogs and like a machine turning in the orbiting of the planets around the sun and so on. And he says, be careful, because if you imagine that the world is really like that, then actually you're in a world that is that, a world that is shaped by the machine. And I use that analogy in particular because, of course, one of the great concerns that many have now is that technology in the form of artificial intelligence, might become a threat rather than just something that's of use. And Blake's saying that there's a kind of preparation that we have engaged with. That is therefore to put us back in more of a kind of active relationship to the technology. Because if we decide or discern that more matters to us once again, then, the technology, we don't need to fight it. It'll just be part of our life rather than risking becoming the whole of our life.
That is really interesting in terms of like just how we frame all of these things, how we make sense of them, the analogies we use, and how that is going to shape our perception of, the technology and lets it into our worlds. And yeah, when you put it in that AI connection, I definitely do see the relevance. I mean, we talk about how all of these revolutions, the industrial revolution, the telecommunication revolution, now the AI revolution, they are reshaping our world, and the arts can be a beautiful way to frame that stuff and to make sense of that and to grapple with these things through symbolism and metaphor and all of that. Yeah, I'm definitely a compelling case for the significance of Blake there. Yeah, go ahead.
So just to underline what you're saying there, Blake goes so far as to say that nations thrive and flourish according to how their poetry and their painting and their music thrive and flourish. And he's not just being a sort of romantic there, making a gesture towards the beautification of life. He's saying something really quite penetrating, that if we don't have that which it takes to produce beautiful music, painting and poetry, we'll be losing a side to ourselves, and a risk, therefore, of the world becoming a place that's not very habitable, that's not very humane. In policy terms, he's saying absolutely we must back the arts as well as the sciences, because then the two will work together and produce a world that is humane and so on.
And so I guess if I could just to kind of pull things back to this is kind of a strange and silly question that I've always liked to ask, but I think it gets at something worthwhile too. I've long asked my guests, when we look at this work, where does this piece belong? Is this a piece for the Louvre, something to cherish for the ages? Is this a piece for the lab that we can learn from, whether we like it or not visually? Or is this one for the loo? It has its time and place, but we don't need to fixate on that. Where do you see, and how do you frame conceptually this work? What's the function of this work in your mind?
I think it's art to live with. Because the way it works is by sort of forming you, speaking into you, even as you spend time with it. And so opening up your vision, your sense of things after some process of engagement. So what I do to make that very concrete is by reproductions of Blake's work, buy a little postcard, sort of stick it on your fridge door perhaps, and see how it communicates to you over a longer period of time. Blake, he even designed ways of presenting his work as public murals, sort of portable public murals, and that could be wheeled into one town square for a few weeks and then wheeled into another town square. So he wants his work to be work that is lived with. It's not just sort of hanging on the wall to celebrate a great figure in some hall. Neither is it, as you say, a kind of technical work that only the very learned in a particular form can begin to understand. The immediacy of it, as well as the strangeness of it, is what he wants us to live with, so that we can see how we're changed as a result.
It's interesting because if I recall correctly, he wasn't like the super academic painter. Like he did study. Like, I think he started off, if I recall correctly, he started off like apprenticing, and he studied a bit at the Royal Academy, but I think it was a brief time there that he left. He wasn't super into the formal, rigid academic methods, but there is something about his work that is like, it feels like it needs a little bit of study. And now I'm curious, do you feel the visual art stands up on its own, or do you feel like you need to read his writings too and get like the cumulative effect of the insights from these different media and different approaches to be able to really understand and appreciate? Because, we started this by saying, like, I had at first only heard of him as a writer, do you think the two play off each other, or do you think they work individually in isolation?
No, I think playing off each other is very much the thing. He felt that we need a multifaceted kind of art where there's resonance, that can be discord as well as harmony, in order for it to have a kind of vibrancy that keeps speaking to us. And I don't know if this is completely true of his work, but as you were saying that, I was just thinking, is there a Blake work that I know that isn't responding either to a text that he placed alongside the imagery, like the Ancient of Days that we were talking about, it comes at the beginning of this poem, or a narrative that the image is clearly relating to him? The obvious case in point there would be that Blake he painted many, many images, which are images of stories from the Bible, but he always gives them a bit of a twist. There was always something in the image, that's not quite in the text. Or also, I've written about Dante as well and the Divine Comedy, and Blake does this set of illustrations for the Divine Comedy, and it's very fascinating to read Dante's text alongside Blake's image, and it gets you questioning, it gets you asking, and that is very much what Blake's about, is trying to bring things to life, because what it insists that you do is bring something from yourself to what you're looking at, and then that is when something comes alive. So definitely he very much he prints illustrated books. That was one of his most beloved forms, and he worked out ways to produce illustrated books relatively cheaply. So the Songs of Innocence and Experience, some of his best known poems like Tiger Tiger, were produced in that way, with imagery wrapping around the words. But I think always to think this is a kind of multi-dimensional experience, even an aphorism. I don't know, the ruins of time build mansions in eternity, or exuberance is delight. And this poetic quality that's in Blake's aphorisms as well, there's color there, even just in the words themselves, that are trying to communicate a spirit, rather than just tell you something straight.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, he's writing this stuff so vividly, and yet you kind of need the image to go along with it. And honestly, for me, I also need the guidebook to go along with that. And that's why I appreciate you explaining so much in a way that even I could understand. And for listeners who want to learn more, like I said, check the links in the show notes. The book is Awake. And Mark Vernon, I really appreciate your taking the time. Thank you so much.
Hey, well, thanks for having me on, because it is in the talking about these things that they come back to life. So I appreciate, inviting me on and having the space and the chance to do so.
Yeah, like I said, one of my favorite things about doing this show is I get to talk to and learn from people who know so much more than I do. And in that conversation, I'm always discovering so much and, processing and coming to better understanding for myself. So I really appreciate your sharing your insights on William Blake, an artist that I'd seen, but not really taken the time to study. And it's fascinating stuff, how all this history and philosophy and everything is coming together in one artist. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.